There are truths that refuse to sleep beneath the earth. They move quietly through the layers of human memory as if searching for a fracture through which they may return to the light. When one steps into the silence between two breaths, it becomes possible to hear the calling of souls that history has covered with heavy veils. And within that stillness, the figure of a woman merges not from the pages of books, but from the very crack of time itself. People tried to erase her, tried to repaint her face, tried to rewrite her story, but the soul does not allow itself to be covered or forgotten. That woman bore the name Charlotte, and as her story begins to stir again, it becomes clear that this is not merely the story of a queen. It is a mirror reflecting a century that attempted to bury its own truth. More than 200 years ago, inside the cold, bright rooms of the palace, something was concealed. A secret the rulers did not wish to open. Not a secret of war or power, but something deeper. A blending of bloodlines, a trace born from the warm soil of Africa, weaving its way into the throne of Europe in an age when racial divisions were rising into harsh and unforgiving walls. When looking at the earliest portraits of Charlotte, one can sense the aura surrounding her. It is not only the shape of her features or the tone of her skin, but a strange light carried by those whose history stretches across generations. Those early portraits reveal a truth later artists attempted to blur. Because if the world looked directly at Charlotte, that world would have to face the greatest question of its age. How could an empire built upon the idea of superiority allow the blood it considered inferior to flow through the genealogy of its own royal house? And so history forced itself to turn. It quietly changed shape, changed color, changed the lines on the woman's face. Yet in art, as in memory, there are things that cannot be buried. The earliest paintings of Charlotte stand like witnesses that refuse to bow. In them, her gaze seems to speak something beyond the canvas, a whisper from an older age meant for generations yet to come. Before wars erupted, before theories of racial division were constructed, before science was used to justify violence, there were people like Charlotte standing on the boundary between two worlds. Their existence made the doctrines of their time fragile, and for that reason they were erased. But truth never dies. It only hides beneath the dust of ambition and power. When the night grows quiet and the noise of the world fades away, the story of Charlotte begins to move again like a soul waiting to be called by name. Now we stand at the beginning of a journey, not a journey to seek blame or accuse history, but a journey into the place where truth was compressed and buried, the place where secrets were sealed by the silence of the powerful. And in that space, the figure of Charlotte becomes clear like a lamp someone has lit from beyond the boundary of time. Listen closely, for what is about to be told is not only a hidden story, but a reminder from history that nothing can remain concealed forever. When the first light falls upon ancient portraits, viewers often notice only the colors, the lines, and the technique of the painter. But some portraits do more than capture a face. They hold within them a whispered story, like a hidden stream running beneath layers of paint, waiting for the day it will be seen. The story of Charlotte does not begin with a throne or a lineage, but with the very paintings that refuse to remain silent. In the early years, when she arrived in England, artists recorded the image of a woman whose beauty carried uncommon features. There was a broader nose, fuller and softer lips, and a complexion that those in the palace were not accustomed to seeing. These paintings were not inventions of imagination. They reflected what the human eye observed. But as time passed and as the empire expanded and the doctrines of racial purity were increasingly constructed, the portraits began to change as if history itself demanded that they be reshaped. The lines of Charlotte's face grew more delicate, more pointed, brighter. The eyes were tightened, the skin was lightened as though she had become another person. It was as if the painter's hand no longer followed what it saw, but what power wanted to see. Each new layer of paint became a layer of memory being covered. Yet, in the deeper realm of art, truth cannot be completely swallowed. When looking across the paintings created over many years, one can sense the contradiction. It is not a difference in skill, but a difference in intention. The sequence of portraits shows a gradual transformation from the face of a woman with African features into a face reshaped to fit the European standard of the 18th century. When viewing the entire sequence, one sees not only the alteration of appearance, but the transformation of an entire era. For what the ruling class feared most was not how Charlotte truly looked, but the question that followed. If the queen carried African heritage, then what heritage did her children bear? Those children would become rulers of the very empire that built its identity upon the idea of white purity. And when that question appeared, the empire had only one choice for its survival. It had to hide the truth. Thus, the later portraits of Charlotte were no longer portraits. They became tools. They did not record history. They created a new one. This is the moment when her story enters the realm of the mysterious, not because of anything supernatural, but because of the way truth resists distortion. When a civilization attempts to bend memory pushes back by leaving marks that cannot be erased. The earliest portraits are those marks. They were painted at a time when people had not yet learned to fear the truth. And in those eyes, one can see something no later artist dared to approach, a presence, a calmness, as if Charlotte knew she was stepping into a world determined to alter her. Yet she stood there, wrapped in deep tones of color, carrying her ancestors with her. Some say that society is a mirror for the soul of its age. If so, these portraits reflect not only Charlotte, but the soul of the empire at that time, a soul divided, wishing to honor the beauty of this woman, yet fearing what that beauty represented. When looking back at the chain of portraits, one must ask who truly changed, Charlotte or those who looked at her. For the alteration did not occur on her face, but in the desire of the era to erase what it believed did not fit its idea of power. The earliest portraits stand like the testimony of a soul. The later ones stand like attempts to rewrite the standards of the empire. And between these two extremes, truth remains still neither lost nor needing defense. It only waited for humanity to become mature enough to face it. For this reason, when Charlotte's story returns in the modern age, it is no coincidence that people turn to the earliest portraits. They are where history speaks most honestly, not through words, but through features that none could change unless they tried. And within their silence lies a strength, a reminder that everything hidden will one day return. Now, as we continue the journey, there is a question to offer you. When facing a truth that has been distorted, what makes you pause longer? The truth itself or the fear of those who tried to hide it? What do you believe frightened them enough to rewrite the face of a queen? Thank you for listening. There are moments in history when a kingdom appears to rise in triumph while its soul sinks beneath its own weight. The 18th century British Empire stood like a mountain of gold gleaming before the world, yet the foundation beneath it trembled with the darkness carried across oceans. Ships moved in quiet sequences, loaded with goods that would be traded for human beings, and the machinery of prosperity spun on the suffering of millions. It was an age that believed itself radiant, but its glow came from torches burning on the backs of enslaved lives. Into this world, a young woman was called. She was 17, hardly more than a figure of delicate frame carrying the traditions of a small German duchy that seemed worlds away from the roar of the empire she was about to enter. Her name Charlotte whispered gently in the halls of her homeland, but in England it would one day echo with weight she never expected. She crossed the sea at a moment when the empire believed it understood itself. Its rulers measured value by skin, by place of birth, by the hierarchy they had carved into the world. Yet destiny often chooses to reveal its contradictions through the most unsuspecting vessels. Charlotte arrived not as a conqueror, not as a symbol of change, but as a bride chosen to steady the image of a king and strengthen alliances. The court welcomed her with ceremony, unaware that the truth carried within her ancestry would one day rise like a tide that no decree could halt. The empire into which she stepped was driven by ambition, but beneath that ambition was here a fear that the system it had built was fragile. Any truth that contradicted its myth of supremacy was considered dangerous. And there, in the quiet innocence of a young queen, that danger lived without her even knowing it. She was chosen by King George III at a time when the empire needed stability. What the realm did not realize was that destiny had woven a paradox into its royal lineage. For generations, Portugal had mingled with the Moors, and traces of that lineage threaded through Charlotte, subtle yet undeniable. She carried within her history the very ancestry the empire sought to set apart as lesser. Some would later see it in her features, others would sense it without knowing how to name it. It was not merely physical, it was something older, a memory held beneath the surface. As Charlotte walked into her new life, the empire continued its expansion. The triangular routes of trade ran like veins of iron. Goods left the ports of Liverpool and Bristol, human beings were taken from African shores, and wealth returned in the form of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. So the empire grew, towering but hollow. Charlotte, unaware of the future debates about her origins, became a symbol of royal continuity. Yet even in her earliest days in court, whispers arose. Some noticed the cast of her complexion, the shape of her features. It was subtle yet undeniable to those who paid attention. People did not speak openly, not because they respected her, but because the truth unsettled them. A queen bearing ancestry from a people the empire sought to control destabilized the narrative that justified its own power. The energy of that fear moved through the court like an invisible current. It did not confront her directly. It reshaped the images around her, recast her presence, and softened what the empire did not know how to accept. What she brought into the palace was not rebellion, it was a quiet challenge. Her existence disrupted the story the empire told about itself. And history has a way of tightening its grip when its illusions are threatened. In the quiet of palace corridors, Charlotte lived her life in innocence of the conflict she embodied. She did not stand before the empire as an adversary. She simply existed in truth. Yet truth itself was enough to unsettle structures built on illusions. As time passed, the contradiction between who she was and what the empire believed began to widen. The world outside continued its march, fueled by the labor of enslaved bodies. Philosophers nurtured theories to justify inequality. Scientists carved false hierarchies into the study of humanity. But all the while, the queen seated beside the king bore the ancestry they claimed could never sit upon a throne. If the empire had understood the depth of this paradox, it would have trembled. For in that singular figure, destiny had placed a mirror before a world that refused to see itself. As the ships continued their routes, as wealth returned to English shores, as voices in the colonies cried in suffering, the Queen lived within the same palace walls that benefited from this system. Yet her presence whispered a truth no law could silence. Because her lineage revealed what the empire feared most, that the boundaries it created were illusions, and the blood it claimed to rank and divide moved freely crossing continents, merging histories, shaping destinies that no decree could erase. Her marriage to the king was meant to symbolize unity, yet it became a symbol of something deeper, something the empire would spend centuries trying to bury. In Charlotte, destiny placed a quiet seed of contradiction inside the heart of a nation built on narrow definitions of identity. And as the empire tightened its grip on the world, that seed waited patient, silent, knowing that one day the soil of history would shift and the truth buried beneath would rise. This was not merely the arrival of a queen. It was the entrance of a paradox destined to unravel a falsehood held for generations. And now that the path has brought us this far, the question becomes clear. How does an empire built on separation react when the truth of its own throne points toward unity? That is the journey we continue to walk through the shadows of the past toward the revelation hidden beneath them. I entered the silence that rests beneath the flow of time, and the threads of an old lineage rose before me like strands of light drifting in dark water. A story long forgotten by kingdoms unfolded not in noise, but in a quiet that reveals more than any proclamation made upon a throne. I saw the ancient Iberian lands where the Moors once walked, carrying with them knowledge, artistry, and a lineage shaped by centuries of movement across deserts and mountains. Their presence left an imprint deeper than any empire wished to admit. The light shimmered, and the faces of those early ancestors emerged, some with the bearing of scholars, some with the grace of nobility. They moved through halls lit by oil lamps, their footsteps echoing across stone floors as they brought with them a heritage tied to North Africa, to the great expanse where sand and sky meet in a silence only the spirit can interpret. I watched their bloodlines shift across generations, weaving into the royal houses of Portugal. The union of King Afonso, the Moorish noblewoman who bore his lineage, did not appear to me as scandal or threat, but as part of a larger unfolding that no human law could control. Every generation carried fragments of that union like embers glowing beneath layers of time. The centuries passed, and those embers traveled through households across marriages, hidden beneath pale garments and courtly rituals. Yet the mark did not fade. It remained alive, living within names and lineages that would one day touch the throne of England. When the vision settled upon Margarita de Castro de Sousa, her presence appeared calm, dignified, as one who carries memory with stillness. She held within her the heritage of the Moors, not as a banner to display, but as a truth that existed regardless of who accepted it. That truth passed through 9 generations until it reached a young girl in a distant German duchy who had no idea how deeply her ancestry would unsettle the foundations of an empire. Charlotte stood before me in the vision, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a descendant shaped by choices made long before her birth. Her blood carried the quiet resilience of those who survived conquest and the unspoken wisdom of those who knew displacement. Her face reflected echoes of ancient lands that stretched far beyond the borders of Europe. The courts of her childhood may never have spoken openly of her Moorish lineage, yet the traces were there interwoven into the story of her family. As I watched the lineage unfold, the sense grew stronger that history rarely reveals its full truth in the moment it occurs. It conceals what threatens the comfort of the powerful and amplifies what supports their designs. The Moorish influence in Charlotte's ancestry was not erased by accident. It was suppressed because it contradicted the myth of purity that rising empires believed they required to justify their order. But the spirit does not bend to political desires. Blood carries memory, and memory cannot be whitewashed without leaving fractures in the story built over it. I saw the Empire of Britain trying to steady itself while shaping its future kings and queens. Yet beneath its effort lay a fundamental contradiction. The very lineage it sought to elevate was inseparable from the ancestry it insisted on diminishing. The Moors, whose wisdom once guided libraries, gardens, mathematics, and architecture, became labeled inferior in the centuries that followed their decline. And still their descendants rose into royal lines without permission from those who believed themselves gatekeepers of identity. The deeper I observed this unfolding, the clearer it became that ancestry is not bound by borders. It travels through unions forged in love alliance, necessity, or chance. It refuses to conform to the boundaries people construct to preserve illusions of control. The line of the Moors traveled silently, patiently, until it entered the body of a queen who would sit beside the ruler of the very nation that built its wealth on the oppression of her distant kin. This was not irony, it was the quiet symmetry of history, the balancing of truths that human institutions try to tilt in their favor. I sensed in Charlotte's lineage a reminder to all who would one day study her life. Heritage is not owned by nations, it is carried by souls across generations, resurfacing when its revelation is needed. And when I looked again upon the Moorish ancestors who shaped her bloodline, I did not see shadows of conflict. I saw a continuum, a passing of identity through centuries that refused to relinquish its essence even when forgotten by the living. This is why Charlotte's ancestry could never truly disappear from the story of the British crown. It lived through portraits, testimonies, whispers, and the unmistakable features observers recorded long before fear demanded silence. The truth remained present even when nations pretended not to see it. As the vision dimmed, one message lingered. Lineage is not merely the movement of blood, it is the movement of memory, the continuity of a heritage that outlives kingdoms and refuses to bow before the narratives constructed to deny it. Charlotte carried that lineage with grace, not as a queen reclaiming a throne for forgotten ancestors, but as a living testament that truth flows onward even when painted over. And now that her lineage stands revealed again, the story becomes not a debate of color purity or hierarchy, but a reminder that ancestry is too ancient and too vast to be contained by the boundaries of any empire. Whispers often cross the boundary between truth and secrecy long before written records dare to follow them. And when The past rose before me like a tapestry stirred by an unseen wind. The faces of those who once stood near Charlotte appeared carrying with them the weight of what they saw but could never speak freely. They did not know their observations would one day become clues, fragments of testimony left behind in a world determined to silence its own contradictions. Yet each of them caught a glimpse of something the empire wished would vanish. Their words spoken in passing became the echoes that refused to die. The vision opened upon a dimly lit drawing room where Sir Walter Scott once sat, quill in hand, eyes narrowed with the sharpness of a man who could read both text and face with equal clarity. He looked upon Charlotte not through the lens of status or expectation, but with the instinct of someone who recognized truth even when wrapped in royal garments. His phrase emerged in the air like a stone thrown into still water, a mulatto countenance. Not a whisper, not a hesitation, but a certainty. He had seen in her features what painters were later commanded to soften. He wrote it plainly not as insult, but as fact. And the empire flinched, for facts have a way of leaving cracks in carefully constructed illusions. The image shifted, and I stood within the chambers of Baron Stockmar, the royal physician whose life had been spent studying bodies, observing details that most people overlook. He, too, noted features that carried echoes of distant lands and ancient lineages. His words were clinical, yet what he saw revealed a truth the empire was unprepared to accept. The features he described did not align with the narrative of purity that the rising racial theories demanded. His testimony lingered like an ink stain court could not erase. Even Queen Victoria's personal physician left behind remarks that traced the same lineage. Though his observations were buried beneath layers of propriety, they remained intact, like artifacts hidden beneath centuries of dust, waiting to be uncovered. Each witness saw the same thing. Their eyes did not lie, though their world wished they would. These were not critics of the crown. They were men bound to the monarchy, loyal to the order that elevated them. And yet their descriptions contradicted the story the empire tried to uphold. This contradiction settled over the court like a haze. The upper rooms of the palace held an unspoken tension, the kind that hums beneath the surface when people pretend not to see what stands openly before them. The more the empire leaned upon racial ideology, the more inconvenient Charlotte's presence became. The witnesses did not set out to expose anything. They merely observed, but observation itself can become dangerous when truth has been declared unacceptable. As I followed the threads of their testimonies, a new landscape opened, one filled with portraits that did not match the descriptions left behind. The earliest paintings, faithful to the truth of her features, carried the warmth and shape that spoke of her ancestry. Yet as time passed, the shift became unmistakable. The nose sharpened, the lips thinned, the complexion brightened. The face of the queen was altered stroke by stroke until she resembled the ideal the empire wished to project. Yet the witnesses had already spoken. Their words stood like sentinels guarding the truth. And in that tension between testimony and revision, the hidden story gained its power. The more the empire tried to shape her image, the more evident the truth became. For nothing reveals the existence of fear more clearly than an attempt to erase what stands openly. I sensed in those early observers a kind of reluctant honesty. They were not activists. They were not visionaries. They were merely people who described what was before them. Yet their voices now serve as beacons in a landscape where history attempted to forge a different path. Their words remind us that truth often survives through those who simply did not know how to lie. As the vision deepened, I felt the weight these witnesses carried without understanding. They lived in a world that believed identity could be defined by decree, hierarchy, and the color of the skin. Yet their eyes captured a face that defied the order built around them. The empire could whitewash portraits. It could reshape narratives. It could silence genealogists and dismiss historians, but it could not remove the words of those who saw Charlotte standing in the full truth of her ancestry, nor could it erase the resonance of that truth moving quietly through time. Their testimonies became markers that guided future generations back to the origins that rulers had attempted to bury. And as I stepped back from the unfolding tapestry, one phrase surfaced with clarity. Truth requires no defense. It survives through the simplest witnesses, the smallest observations, the unpolished remarks that escape the reach of those who seek control. Charlotte's features, recorded by those who saw her face, directly carried a lineage the empire could not silence, no matter how many portraits it altered. The witnesses saw the queen not as history wished to remember her, but as she was. And their words now form a bridge between what was hidden and what is finally being revealed. No canvas remains silent when truth is altered upon it. Even when the surface appears calm, the layers beneath hold memory. And as I entered the vision of the shifting portraits of Queen Charlotte, a strange tension moved through the air like the moment before a storm when the sky changes color but the wind has not yet begun to speak. The earliest painting rose first. The artist Alan Ramsay stood before the young queen, his gaze steady, his hand unshaken. He painted what stood before him, not what the empire preferred to see. In every stroke, the truth remained intact. The fullness of her lips, the broader structure of her nose, the warm undertone of her complexion. Nothing in his brush hinted at hesitation. He saw a queen shaped by a lineage woven through centuries, and he allowed the canvas to bear witness. But time is a force that kingdoms fear for it, brings clarity as well as erosion. As the years passed, the air around the vision thickened, and new paintings appeared one by one, lined like mirrors, reflecting the shifting desires of an empire trying to change its own reflection. The differences were subtle at first, as though the artists were quietly testing how much they could soften without stirring suspicion. A slightly lifted nose, a lighter wash of the skin, a narrowing of the face. Yet the more the empire tried to bend her image, the more the truth resisted. It was not rebellion, it was simply presence. A presence that refused to vanish no matter how many layers of paint were applied. Then the later portrait surfaced glowing with unnatural brightness, shaped by hands that did not seek truth but obedience. The queen's features in these later works no longer carried the echoes of her Moorish ancestors. They were replaced by an idealized form that belonged to a narrative crafted for comfort, not accuracy. The canvas had become a servant of the empire's anxieties. I felt the weight of each brushstroke as if the silence around me tightened every time a feature was erased. These alterations were not mere artistic reinterpretations. They were artifacts of fear, a fear that arose when the empire realized its ideology had collided with its own lineage. The more deeply Britain committed itself to the logic of racial hierarchy, the more urgently it needed Charlotte to look like the vision it claimed was superior. But truth does not bend to ideology. When an empire attempts to alter a face, it leaves behind evidence of its struggle. The sequence of portraits became a chronicle of denial, each painting a step further from the original, each revision revealing more about the anxieties of the age than about the queen herself. As I moved deeper into the vision, I sensed the artists who'd been given quiet instructions. Their hands trembled not from technical doubt, but from the burden of reshaping a human being into a symbol that matched the desires of the ruling world. Some resisted, gently leaving small signs of the old lineage in the curve of a cheek or the shadow beneath an eye. Others complied fully, erasing layer after layer as though the truth of a person could be repainted into nothingness. Yet even in the most altered portraits, something remained, a trace, a subtle echo. The past held its ground beneath the paint, refusing to surrender entirely. It was as if the heritage within her was anchored too deeply to be removed. The empire believed it was changing her image to match its myth. In reality, it revealed the myth itself because only a fragile story demands such desperate revision. Only a threatened belief system needs to repaint its queen. And only an empire unsure of its own legitimacy tries to science ancestry with pigment and brush. I felt the deeper lesson rising from these portraits. When truth is altered for the sake of power, the distortion becomes its own confession. No historian is required. The paintings themselves testify. They show the empire's discomfort. They show the gradual tightening of racial ideology. They show a lineage that could not be accepted because it contradicted the beliefs used to justify domination. Each portrait became a marker of a struggle not between artist and subject, but between empire and truth. The more I observed, the clearer the design became. The erasure was not a single act, it was a process, a slow unfolding of fear disguised as refinement, a quiet rewriting of identity hidden beneath layers of artistic convention. And still, the essence of Charlotte endured. No empire, no matter how wealthy or vast, can fully erase the truth carried by a face. Ancestry reveals itself in patterns stronger than political pressure. It lives in bone structure, in subtle tones of skin, in the harmony of features shaped by centuries of movement across continents. It lives in memory passed through blood. It lives in the tension between what is painted and what is preserved. And so the portraits remain an unbroken chain that reveals more than any official record dared to admit. They show the empire's attempt to rewrite its story, but they also show the impossibility of such a rewriting, because truth has a structure too intricate to dismantle with a brush. As the vision faded, the paintings settled back into silence, yet their presence lingered. They're not merely images, they are witnesses. Each one carries the weight of what was done, what was altered, and what could never be fully concealed. And history, with all its attempts at erasure, ultimately left behind the very evidence that will one day reveal what it sought to hide. The canvas remembers, even when the world pretends it does not. Silence settled across the vision like a curtain before revelation, and what rose next was not a face or a portrait, but a pressure that had lived beneath the empire, like a heartbeat it tried desperately to ignore. Power often speaks loudly, yet fear speaks more quietly. And in the empire that once claimed dominion over continents, the quietest truth was the one it feared most. A queen bearing ancestry from the very people it enslaved did not merely trouble the royal household. It threatened the entire structure of justification that the empire had built brick by brick across oceans. The vision opened upon a chamber in which scholars once argued, their voices wrapped in the rigid certainty of men who believed they understood the order of the world. They wrote treatises declaring hierarchy as natural law, proclaiming the superiority of one race over another, shaping theories with cold precision to support a system already soaked in suffering. And within those theories lay the foundation the empire relied upon to continue its expansion. But as the vision moved deeper, I saw that These arguments were made not from strength, but from fear, a fear that the world was wider than their definitions, that ancestry did not obey their boundaries, that the truth of human origins was far too intertwined to fit within their constructed hierarchies. The arrival of Charlotte with her lineage, woven through Moorish ancestry, illuminated that fear like a lantern set in a dark corridor. The empire could silence enslaved voices, manipulate laws, and constrain public discourse, yet it could not control the bloodline seated beside the king. That contradiction sat in the throne room like an unspoken prophecy. The system sensed it, even if it could not name it. And so began the empire's subtle war against the truth embodied by the queen. It was not fought with armies or cannons. It was fought through ink, silence, revision, and the insistence that the world look away from what stood plainly before it. The deeper I watched, the more apparent it became that this struggle was not about single queen. It was about an entire worldview that trembled at the possibility that its foundation rested upon fiction. The empire claimed racial superiority, yet its monarchy carried lineage from a people it labeled inferior. The empire claimed divine order, placed it above others. Yet the blood of its queen bore connection to lands it sought to dominate. The empire claimed civilization was its gift to the world. Yet the very symbols of that civilization, the crown and the throne, were tied to histories older and broader than the empire dared acknowledge. These contradictions gathered like storm clouds. In courts, politicians spoke in coded language, avoiding direct confrontation, yet circling the truth like guards around a secret door. They understood that admitting Charlotte's ancestry would unravel the justification for their empire. If a queen could carry African blood and still embody grace, intelligence, and sovereignty, then the ideology claiming Africans were lesser could not stand. The empire's mind could not accept this. So it chose denial, not through confession, but through omission. Not by rewriting laws, but by reshaping perception. Science was bent to serve power. Philosophers twisted arguments to preserve hierarchy. Writers reinforced the myths that solidified racial divisions. And through it all, Charlotte lived within the palace as both a symbol of unity and a reminder of contradiction. The empire never asked her to hide her lineage. It simply acted as though it did not exist. But silence is its own kind of speech, and that silence grew louder with each passing year. From within the vision, I saw the split forming like a crack in a stone. On one side stood the system desperate to protect the narrative that kept its order intact. On the other side stood truth, unmoving, patient, refusing to retreat. The struggle was not equal. Truth does not wield armies. It does not write decrees or shape kingdoms. Yet truth endures where power decays because truth does not depend on approval. It simply is. And Charlotte's presence revealed a truth the empire would spend centuries attempting to bury. The world is not divided by the lines humans draw. Heritage flows like rivers crossing borders and mountains. Blood remembers what politics forgets. Identity refuses to comply with systems built on separation. The more the empire insisted on its superiority, the more deeply it feared the queen who disproved its claims simply by existing. I sensed that the greatest threat to the empire's ideology was not rebellion, uprising, or war. It was the quiet dignity of a woman whose ancestry connected her to those the empire oppressed. A lineage they deemed lesser stood in the highest court. A heritage they sought to erase stood at the center of their monarchy. A truth they refused to acknowledge lives in the blood of future kings and queens. That truth placed a mirror before the empire, and the reflection was unbearable. So the system did what systems often do when confronted with light: it hid its eyes, it turned away, it pretended the mirror was empty. But truth waits, truth endures, truth rises in the cracks where silence fails. And in the shadow of the empire, the light that Charlotte carried did not extinguish. It moved quietly through generations, waiting for the day when the world would finally look upon it without fear. A stillness opened before me like a corridor stretching across time, and within that stillness, the royal bloodline appeared, moving from one generation to the next, like a river that refused to be dammed or diverted. It did not flow according to the desires of kings nor the doctrines of scholars. It followed its own ancient path, carrying within it the inheritance of lands far older than the empire that will one day try to contain it. The descendants of Charlotte rose in the vision, one after another, not as portraits on palace walls, but as living threads woven into the vast tapestry of Europe. Her 15 children grew into adulthood, and each carried something of her presence, a presence that the empire tried to ignore even as it shaped the lineage of future rulers. I watched the line move outward, branching into courts across Germany, Russia, Denmark, and beyond, spreading Charlotte's ancestry far wider than the rulers of her time imagined possible. Every marriage extended her lineage. Every birth carried fragments of the heritage the empire declared unacceptable. Yet the bloodline continued its journey as if guided by a purpose larger than the designs of any royal council. The vision lingered on Victoria, the granddaughter, who would one day become the face of an empire at its height. Her presence radiated both strength and sorrow, and beneath the symbols of power surrounding her stood the quiet truth she never publicly named. Her lineage carried echoes that stretched back to Moorish ancestors, carried forward through Charlotte, passed into her veins long before she wore the crown. Some who saw her noted features that did not fit neatly into the European ideal her empire claimed. They recorded her darker complexion, the fullness of her face, the traits that whispered of origins beyond the narrow categories her world insisted upon. They did not speak openly, for the empire had already begun reinforcing its myths with meticulous care. But the truth remained etched into the features of its monarch. From Victoria, the lineage expanded again. Edward VII inherited it. George V carried it into a world trembling on the edge of global conflict. Edward VIII, though his reign was brief, bore the same ancestral story. George VI passed it to a daughter who would one day rule longer than any monarch before her. And Elizabeth II, revered across the globe, carried in her blood the inheritance the empire had attempted to erase from its own memory. Nothing in her presence suggested a woman shaped by deceit. Rather, she embodied continuity, unaware that her very existence stood as quiet testimony to a truth the empire had painted over centuries earlier. I felt the weight of this revelation as the vision unfolded. For if Charlotte's ancestry touched Victoria and Victoria's descendants carried it forward, then every monarch who followed bore within them the lineage of the Moors. This meant the empire's own ruling line disproved the ideology that had justified colonial domination. Blood is indifferent to hierarchy. It moves where it will, crossing borders, merging histories, ignoring the lines drawn by those who fear its freedom. And so the truth lived on not in rebellion, but in continuity. It flowed into Charles III, into the princes of the modern age, into the lineage that continues today. No portrait, no archives, no subtle erasure could undo what ancestry had already woven. The vision then revealed a symbolic image, the kind that speaks beyond language. A crown appeared suspended in a field of darkness, and from its center radiated strands of light reaching outward in every direction. Each strand represented a generation. Beneath the crown, the lines converged into a single point, a single source the moment Charlotte entered the royal family. And beneath her stood the luminous imprint of the Moorish heritage that traveled through 9 generations before reaching her. This imprint pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, unbroken, untouched by the interventions of time. I watched as the strands extended to the present day, each carrying the same pulse. The message was unmistakable. The truth does not disappear simply because history refuses to speak it. It continues, it persists. It lives in those who inherit it, unaware, shaping the destiny of people who have never heard the story behind their own lineage. This understanding grew stronger as the vision shifted once more. I saw the faces of European monarchs who had intermarried with Charlotte's descendants, kings of Belgium, queens of Denmark, Tsars of Russia, princes across the German states, each carrying echoes of her ancestry. Without knowing it, Europe's royal houses had become custodians of a lineage that defied the racial boundaries they tried to uphold. This was not irony. It was the quiet symmetry of ancestry asserting itself across time. The empire believed it could define identity with proclamations, laws, and doctrines, but identity is older than empire, older than conquest, older than the categories created to justify domination. Identity is shaped by the merging of stories across centuries, by the movement of people across continents, by the choices of ancestors who never imagined their descendants would one day rule nations. What the empire tried to hide became the very foundation of its future generations. The bloodline carried Charlotte's truth forward, like a message sealed within the body, waiting to be recognized. And now, as the vision receded, the message remained clear. No system built on separation can erase the unity already written into its own lineage. No empire can claim purity when its throne carries the heritage of the world it sought to divide. No story constructed through fear can survive when the truth flows quietly through the veins of its rulers. The bloodline endures, and in its endurance lies the revelation that what was once hidden now stands ready to be remembered. Long after the empire had buried its contradictions beneath polished ceremonies and rewritten histories, the vision revealed a different kind of movement rising through the centuries. It did not come from palaces or scholars loyal to the crown. It came from those who sensed that something had been concealed, that a fragment of truth had slipped between the lines of official records, and waited for those willing to search without fear. These seekers appeared before me not as a single generation, but as a procession stretching through time, each one guided by a quiet conviction that history was incomplete. They did not share backgrounds or motives. Some were historians, others genealogists, others ordinary individuals drawn by intuition. Yet all of them reached toward the same hidden thread. The first figure who stepped forward was Jay. Rogers carrying his books as though they were lanterns in a darkened archive. He lived in a century that still clung to old hierarchies, yet he examined the past with a courage that defied the era's constraints. When he traced Charlotte's lineage to her Moorish roots, he spoke a truth that the empire had tried to silence. He found what had been buried not through fantasy, but through records that had always been there, overlooked by those who refused to acknowledge their implication. Rogers did not shout his findings. He simply placed them into the world, trusting that truth has its own gravity. The Empire ignored him, dismissing his work as fringe speculation. But truth does not measure itself by acceptance. It persists even when denied. After Rogers, I saw researchers in the late 20th century who approached the mystery with the tools of modern scholarship. They traced family trees, examined archives, and reconnected the branches that had been severed by political desire. Genealogists followed trails that stretched across continents through centuries of marriage records and forgotten documents. As they worked, the shape of a suppressed lineage became clearer. The evidence did not appear as a dramatic revelation. It emerged gradually like a shoreline revealed as the tide retreats. Then the vision shifted to the documentary produced by PBS in the late 1990s. Cameras moved through old European archives, lingering on dusty genealogical charts that showed the connections others had chosen not to see. The researchers presented their findings calmly, neither sensational nor hesitant. They simply traced the ancestry as it was, revealing that Charlotte's lineage did indeed reach back to the Moors. Their work might have redefined royal history, yet the empire met it with silence. Not denial, not correction, simply silence. A silence that revealed more than any official statement could have. For silence is the final refuge of those who fear the truth but can no longer oppose it openly. As the 21st century unfolded in the vision, science entered the story with a new clarity. Geneticists studied the patterns of inheritance and the probabilities embedded in Charlotte's ancestry. They examined the genealogical records with precision, confirming the likelihood of her African heritage. But even as the evidence strengthened, the royal institutions offered no acknowledgement. They hesitated to authorize DNA testing not because the science was uncertain, but because the answer would carry consequences far beyond the walls of any laboratory. In the vision, I saw the quiet determination in the faces of these researchers. They did not pursue recognition or reward. They pursued restoration. They understood that history is not merely a record of what happened, but a reflection of who we choose to become. To erase part of the past is to cripple the understanding of the present. And so they continued their work knowing that resistance from the powerful was inevitable. Yet truth grows stronger when met with resistance. And something remarkable began to happen. Individuals outside academia started to notice the inconsistencies. Artists analyzed the early portraits. Historians questioned the abrupt changes in later paintings. People around the world began asking why a queen's features would shift so dramatically over time. Conversations emerged in communities far removed from royal circles. Each question chipped away at the silence that had protected the empire's narrative. These seekers formed a chorus of inquiry that stretched across continents. They did not collaborate intentionally, but their combined attention created a pressure the old narrative could no longer escape. It became clear that the story of Charlotte had never fully disappeared. It had lived in whispers, in overlooked documents, in the eyes of people who saw their own history reflected in hers. It had survived because truth does not wither when neglected. It waits in the quiet spaces where memory endures. In the vision, I saw the seekers as guardians of a truth that belonged not only to Charlotte, but to all descended from Erasistries. They reminded the world that knowledge is not owned by institutions, it is discovered by those who refuse to turn away from the uncomfortable. They approach the past not with suspicion, but with reverence, understanding that uncovering truth is an act of healing. And the truth they uncovered held a lesson far larger than Charlotte's own story. It showed that the histories of peoples once oppressed and dismissed are intertwined with the very institutions that claim superiority over them. It revealed that attempts to separate humanity into categories had always been illusions. And it proved that suppressed truths eventually rise carried forward by those who choose curiosity over obedience. As the vision faded, a final image appeared. A manuscript lay open upon a polished table. Some lines were bright with clarity. Others had been smudged, erased, rewritten. But beneath the erasures, faint yet still visible, the original words endured. Charlotte's story rested there, resilient, waiting for each seeker who would approach it. And the message she carried through time was unmistakable. The truth does not vanish because it is hidden. The truth returns because someone is willing to look. I entered the quiet once more, the same quiet that has carried the memories of ages long after the voices that shaped them have fallen silent. And in that stillness, I felt the truth of Charlotte rise before me, not as a figure of royalty alone, but as a reminder of what history attempts to bury when it fears its own reflection. The visions I had witnessed did not come as judgment upon a nation, nor as reproach to those who shaped the past. They came as reflections, as layers of memory resurfacing from beneath the weight of centuries. And now, as the final veil lifted, I understood that the story of this queen was never meant to remain hidden. It returned because the world had reached a moment when forgetting could no longer serve its growth. I saw Charlotte once more, not as a young bride stepping into a palace that feared her lineage, nor as a figure reshaped by the hands of artists commanded to alter her truth. I saw her as she stood in the deeper pattern of history where ancestry flows like light across generations, unconcerned with boundaries drawn by empires. Her story did not exist to accuse or condemn, but to reveal. It revealed how the structures of power bend truth to protect themselves. It revealed how fear weaves itself into culture, policy, and art when a single face threatens the foundation of an ideology. It revealed how the erasure of one woman became a symbol for the erasure of millions whose stories were pressed into silence by the weight of empire. And yet it revealed something greater, that no truth once set into motion by the lives of human beings can ever be fully erased. In the vision, I saw the empire draw its maps, write its laws, build its monuments, and declare itself the pinnacle of civilization. But behind these proclamations lay a deep fracture. The throne that represented purity of blood carried within it a lineage that connected it to lands the empire sought to subjugate. The struggle to deny this connection became a mirror of the empire's deeper struggle to deny the humanity of those it oppressed. But truth does not disappear because it is inconvenient. Truth remains steady, waiting for those who will look without fear. As I watched the lineage move into the modern age, I felt the weight of a realization many had not considered. The descendants of Charlotte, seated upon thrones in grand halls, carried within them the very ancestry that racial theories once declared inferior. This was not contradiction, it was correction. A reminder that the hierarchies built by human hands collapse when measured against the vast and ancient truth of shared origin. The erasure of Charlotte's heritage was not simply a historical act, it was an attempt to maintain a world built on division. And when that world began to crumble beneath its own contradictions, the truth of her life resurfaced to show the path that had always existed beneath the surface. In the vision, the portraits glimmered like windows into parallel timelines. The early paintings, standing in quiet defiance, held the truth the empire tried to hide. The later paintings revealed the empire's fear more clearly than any written record. The silence of the archives, the absence of acknowledgement, the refusal to permit testing of her remains, all of it spoke a single message. Those who fear truth fear themselves. Yet the truth persisted. In each generation of the royal line, in the scholars who rediscovered the records, in the communities that carried the story orally, refusing to let it extinguish. I felt then the deeper meaning Charlotte carried into the modern age. Her story rises not to challenge the legitimacy of rulers or to reshape royal history into an argument. It rises because humanity is ready to confront the illusions it inherited. The idea of racial purity, the belief in hierarchy as destiny, the assumption that history belongs to the powerful alone, these illusions dissolve when confronted by the truth of her lineage. And in that dissolution, something ancient awakens, a memory that all people share a common origin, a reminder that division is a construct woven by fear, not by nature, a call to undo the stories that have separated human beings from one another. Charlotte's story survived centuries of erasure because the human spirit does not forget what it needs to remember. It waited for the moment when the world would be willing to listen. And now the vision shows the truth standing open, waiting not for kings or scholars, but for ordinary souls willing to embrace what history once denied. Her ancestry carried through generations speaks not of royalty, but of unity. It tells us that no lineage is pure because purity is not part of human design. Humanity is a tapestry woven from countless crossings, and it is in these crossings, not in imagined separations, that our true history resides. As I moved out of the vision, one message followed like a tide carrying the last echo of a distant shore. The truth rises because the time for division is ending. The truth returns because the world is ready to release the illusions that once served its fear. And the truth endures because it belongs to everyone, not only to those who once held power. Charlotte is not simply a queen whose heritage was hidden. She is a reminder that what is erased will one day reappear. She is the symbol of the future written into the past. She is the quiet voice of ancestry calling the world back to itself. And as the vision closed, I understood one final truth: nothing forgotten remains forgotten forever.